I'm Jack Knott, and I'm the Dean of the USC Saul Price School of Public Policy, and I'm delighted to welcome you to campus for this important policy breakfast, which will discuss Prop 10, the proposed repeal of the Costa-Hawkins Act. I discovered as Dean I have a little bit of authority. I requested that the drapes come down so that we could not have the sun in our eyes, and it happened. So that doesn't usually happen when I ask the faculty to do things. So it's a good morning already. We launched the Dean's Policy Breakfast Series to convene civic and business leaders to share their in-depth expertise on really important issues facing our communities. But before we get into the discussion of Prop 10, some of you may not know that much about the Price School, and I'd just like to spend a couple minutes giving you a little bit of background. So USC Price is an interdisciplinary school with a focus on solving the critical issues facing society, but also planning and developing better communities for the future. Developing better communities requires expertise from an intersecting set of disciplines, including real estate and urban economics, public and private finance, urban planning, urban policy, as well as substantive knowledge in healthcare, housing, transportation, and community development, among others. It's really, we take a problem-focused interdisciplinary approach to urban development. And the Price School has faculty expertise in all these areas. And it's also the home to the highly regarded USC Lusk Center for Real Estate, which is a joint venture with the USC Marshall School of Business. In addition, the school offers degrees in public policy, urban planning, public administration, health administration, as well as the Dollinger Master of Real Estate Development, the MRED degree, and our undergraduate Bachelor's of Science in Real Estate Development, our BRED degree. So for more than 30 years now, our school, our real estate, and our urban planning degree programs have really leveraged this interdisciplinary expertise, and our students have gained exposure to real estate fundamentals, real estate finance, and real estate law, but they've also learned about policy regulations, urban design, demographics, and community relations. So this is the type of community and real estate development that we teach at the Price School. It's analytical, it's engaging, and it's inclusive. And this comprehensive approach that spans finance, development, and urban economics, as well as an understanding of community interest, is, I think, what makes us so special and unique as a school. And it's also why I believe the Price School is among the highest ranked schools of public policy in the country. According to U.S. News and World Report this year, we are now ranked number 2 out of 283 schools nationwide. And interestingly, we're also ranked number 1 in the nation in urban policy, and I believe that is due to the success of our real estate economics, our urban economics, and our urban planning focus in the school. I want to start with Professor Richard Green. He's the director of the USC Lusk Center for Real Estate. He's also the chair of our Policy Analysis and Real Estate Department in the Price School. Next to him is Rochelle Mills. She's president and CEO of Innovating Housing Opportunities. It's a Southern California nonprofit affordable housing developer engaged in the well-being of low and moderate income individuals and families, and they've been doing this for over 4 decades in Orange County. Chris Payne is a managing director of Sares-Regis Group, a vertically integrated real estate investment company, and we're proud to say a graduate of our MRED program at the Price School. And Molly Rysman is the Housing and Homelessness Deputy in the Office of Los Angeles County Supervisor Sheila Kuehl. And Sheila, Supervisor Kuehl, wanted to be here today but because of a conflict wasn't able to make it. So we're very happy, Molly, that you can join us. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. Now I'd like to just take a moment so that we're all kind of on the same page to provide a few facts about Proposition 10. Proposition 10 allows California voters to decide whether or not to repeal the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act of 1995. So we got to start is, what is the Costa-Hawkins Act? It really has three main provisions. One is it enacts vacancy control, which allows property owners to raise rent to market rates once existing tenants move out. That's the first provision. Second provision is it exempts single-family homes and condos from rent control provisions. And then third, it prevents cities from enacting rent control regulations on apartments built after 1995 or when local rent control laws went into effect. So those are the three provisions of the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act. For example, Los Angeles passed its own rent control laws in 1978, so rent control does not apply to dwellings built after that time. And also for reference, there are a number of cities in Southern California that do have rent control, and I want to identify what some of those are so you get a sense of the scope of this issue. In Northern California, Alameda, Berkeley, East Palo Alto, Hayward, Los Gatos, Mountain View, Oakland, Richmond, San Francisco, and San Jose all have some rent control. In Southern California, Beverly Hills, Los Angeles, Palm Springs, Santa Monica, and West Hollywood all have some form of rent control. So what this means is that a yes vote on Prop 10 would repeal the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act. This would allow municipalities to impose rent control for single-family homes and condos and or limit how much a property owner can increase rent when a tenant moves out. The measure itself does not make or propose any changes to local rent control laws, and with few exceptions, cities would actually need to enact separate laws to change their local laws if Prop 10 passes. A vote no on Prop 10 would continue to allow the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act to go forward. So a vote no makes no changes to state or local law. So it's a little bit of an unusual proposition in that regard. And I'm hoping it's not confusing to people, which why I thought it would be worthwhile to take a moment just to describe it. But now I'd like to start, and I'm going to turn for some initial comment to Professor Green, but I'm going to ask the rest of the panelists to weigh in on this as well. And that is, how did we get to this point, and why is this measure of interest to so many people?
So I think, let me just not be coy, I'm against Prop 10. So everything I'm about to say reflects that position. But I do understand why we have it, why it's here. The reason it's here is people are upset. And people are upset because if you look at the typical renter, not just in California, but nationwide, they're worse off than they were 16, 17 years ago. What do I mean by that is if you look at the median renter's income, so we're not talking about the bottom of the market even, we're talking about the median, it has not risen as quickly as median rents have in about 95% of American metropolitan areas. If you want affordable housing, turns out Gadsden, Alabama is the best place in the country you can go. I can't say I ever had the pleasure of visiting there, but that is a place where incomes have risen more than rents. But nearly everywhere else, as I said, about 95% of cities, that's happened. Now, why is this happening? And I think people who know me expect that I'm going to talk about supply, and I will ultimately talk about it, but there are also demand pressures. And there are three particular kind of demand pressures that I think we need to worry about. The first is about the nature of cities, and in terms of how people are moving from one city to another and how people are moving within cities. So there's a fundamental issue, which is that labor markets are very segmented. So you have, like, physicians work as physicians. If you are working as a carpenter, no matter how many physician jobs there are, you're not going to be able to take a job as a physician unless you go to school for 4 years and do a residency and so on. So labor markets are very segmented. Housing markets aren't. Okay, housing markets are more integrated. And so what we've observed is low-skilled cities losing high-skilled people to high-skilled cities. When the low-skilled cities lose those high-skilled people, their wages fall. So that's why they're worse off in terms of housing. What happens in high-skilled cities like San Diego, Los Angeles, which isn't quite as high-skilled as the other Californians, but still, certainly the western half of LA County is high-skilled. San Diego, Los Angeles, Orange County, the Bay Area. High-skilled people are moving into these high-skilled cities, and while they are having spillover benefits, people's wages go up because of this. For low-skilled people in these cities, their wages don't go up as much as their rents do, their cost of housing does. So you have people in low-skilled places are worse off because their wages are falling, and low-skilled people in high-skilled cities are worse off because their rents are going up faster than their wages are. And I think that's one reason why people are upset. Second thing that's going on is, and within the metropolitan area, so if you look at LA as a region, you see better educated people moving into LA and Orange County, and lower educated people are moving out to Riverside, San Bernardino County, and places like Palmdale and Lancaster, which is still in LA County. The second reason you've had an impact on demand is changes in the kind of households we're forming. Is people aren't getting married at the pace that they were 10, 20, 30 years ago. One of the best predictors of whether people are homeowners or renters is whether they get married or not. If people aren't getting married, that means they're renters. And so that's putting particular pressure on the rental market vis-a-vis the homeowning market, now that we don't have pressure on the homeowning market too here in Southern California. So you have that demand pressure. And then the third thing is we always get mortgage policy wrong. Back in 2005, when it was an awful time to buy a house, we made credit easily available to vulnerable people to buy houses who have since been foreclosed on. 2009 was the best time in the last 30 years in California to buy a house, and there was no credit available to people to do so. And so what you have is people were foreclosed out of their houses, people couldn't buy houses when there was a great opportunity to do so, and now they're stuck in the rental market. And so you have this series of demand pressures pushing up rents. On the supply side, I'm going to say two things. One is, yes, I think California has a lot of rules in place that make it very difficult to build here. I talked to developers. Building something in LA, a unit in LA costs a minimum of $400,000 because of the combination of fees, rules, and the cost of land. And so regulatory relief is going to be an important component of any solution to this problem. But you know what? While I strongly support doing that, it won't be the solution by itself. Because the other issue that I think is the really naughtiest one to get around is if you think of any successful coastal city in the world, think of London, it's almost coastal. You think of Hong Kong, you think of Singapore, you think of Boston, Seattle, LA, San Francisco. They're all expensive. Because what's happening to these places? Well, they're attractive places. They attract the most skilled people. They push up demand. And again, it's the composition of the people. LA County is not growing very fast anymore in terms of population, but the composition of the people who are coming here, the sort of people who push up rents. And again, we could do better with regulatory relief, but at the end of the day, we have an ocean on one side of it and mountains on the other, and that almost surely has an impact. And so I think the reason we're here, people are desperate for solutions. Personally, I don't think this is a good one, but I understand why people are looking for a solution to what is a very real problem.
Great. Thank you, Richard. I do sit on a board that is building affordable housing. It's a nonprofit, and this is in San Diego. And if you include parking,
that's one of the things.
1,000 foot supposedly affordable apartment, it costs, according to the estimates we looked at, over $500,000 to build, which is unsustainable. And so at that end, it's a really huge issue.
I'll follow Richard's lead and start by just saying I'm a Prop 10 supporter. My boss is a Prop 10 supporter. And we're Prop 10 supporters not because we think Prop 10 is going to solve the affordable housing crisis. There is no magic bullet to the affordable housing crisis. No one policy is going to get us out of the situation we're in. And the situation's really dire. The consequences on people's lives are tremendous. And we see that in our homeless crisis. We see that in 1 in 3 renters being severely rent burdened. We're in a really, really bad place and people are really suffering. We do see that rent stabilization, and I just want to clarify because I think what we have now and what we're going to continue to see is rent stabilization. So the difference between rent stabilization and rent control is that rent control includes vacancy control, which I don't think we're really going to see, even though repealing Costa-Hawkins technically legally opens the door for local jurisdictions to do vacancy control. I really don't think there's the political will for vacancy control. So I think what you're going to see is rent stabilization, which is where you have vacancy decontrol, which means, as you said, when the unit becomes vacant, it goes to market. So I think that's what we're going to continue to see. What we see when we have rent stabilization is that it doesn't have a huge impact either way. I actually thought the LA Times editorial supporting Prop 10 was a really good editorial because it's basically the message was, let's relax. This isn't going to solve the affordable housing crisis, and it's not going to end building in California. And that's because, like I said, I think politically, the most dramatic parts of Costa-Hawkins repeal are not going to come to fruition. But I do think we're going to see rent stabilization, and who that impacts is tenants who stay in their rentals more than 5 years. That's what the studies show, is that if you are a renter who stays in a unit more than 5 years, rent stabilization can benefit you. And that's really important because if we look at this year's homeless count, homelessness actually went down for almost every demographic except older adults. We saw a 22% increase in older adults becoming homeless. So we're seeing a lot of people, particularly older adults who are on fixed incomes, who are really suffering from this relationship between rents and incomes that has been getting farther and farther apart. And I would argue, I think, Richard, you said the last 15 years. I would say the last 40 years is really what the data shows us, is that relationship between incomes and rents have gotten increasingly separated and farther apart. And that is an issue not just in California, where we do have a lot of regulations that make it hard to build, and we should talk about reducing some of those regulations, because we may be talking about different regulations we want to lift to make it easier to build. But we see that even in places like Texas, that has a very, much more lenient building environment than we have in California. We also see the relationships between incomes and rents going in the wrong direction. The Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard, in their national State of the Nation's Housing, I think is what their annual report is called, really highlighted this, that we no longer see rental units filtering to people. We no longer see rental units filtering down to low-cost rental units. No matter how much we build, you see this in Seattle. Seattle's doing a great job of increasing supply. I want to increase supply like they are in Seattle. They're doing a great job. But even with that, we don't see units filtering down, which is a real concern. So this is a broader issue that, like I said, is going to take many different interventions to get ahead of.
I think that they did a good job of explaining it on both ends. I fall somewhere in the middle. Innovative Housing Opportunities, and we call ourselves IHO, is a nonprofit affordable housing developer. But we also pride ourselves on having a business sense. And at the end of the day, we need to be able to produce units and still keep ourselves afloat. It doesn't do us any good to develop units that we can't cash flow and that we eventually have to sell to market rate. One of the challenges that I find in the legislation that comes from well-meaning are the unintended consequences. And the fear that I have is, even though Molly says that some of the items will likely not move into fruition, the fact that they're dangled out there and can is a challenge for us. Developers nowadays are looking at not only building new units, rehabbing existing, and the term is naturally occurring affordable housing, or NOAHs. And that's identifying existing units and moving them to affordability, because those units are in communities where you don't want displacement, where you want to make sure that you are upgrading the buildings and that you have the opportunity to keep those people in place, that they can age in place and that you can preserve those units. My concern is at some point when it gets rougher and we are put in a position where we cannot raise the rent, but we still have a mandate and an obligation through our compliance agreements to upgrade. I've seen a lot of our colleagues running pretty close to the make or break level, and I don't want to be put in that same position. They say that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and I know that these are not easy ideas to work with, but I'm worried about mandating something that can eventually tie the hands of affordable housing developers. And one thing I will say in particular with, for example, HUD housing, you have an opportunity after a period of time to do a markup to market, which means that you can raise those rents. Now, these are units that have a project-based Section 8, so they're paying the difference between that low-income rent and the market rent. But at some point, you're going to have to continue to upgrade these buildings, and that allows us as developers to do that. Right now, I don't see in the way that the Proposition 10 is worded that we have that opportunity, and I'm wondering who makes that. And if it is at the hand of a contentious, election cycle, will we end up, again, the collateral damage? So that's my only concern, is that I know we have a problem to solve. Most nonprofit developers are vested in serving our communities for the long term, but these well-meaning legislation coming out can actually hurt those it's intending to help.
Good. I can see this is such an important issue. Everybody's getting into what they want to see happen. I was trying to just understand how we got to where we are, so we're going to follow up on some of the issues that you have raised. Molly, I did want to ask one clarifying question with what you said. You said it's not likely to raise, even if this Prop 10 passes, it's unlikely to have an effect on vacancy, so that if people move out, it's unlikely that rents will then be frozen. What about cities like Santa Monica, for example, that had rent control before, and they go back to what they had before, where they did have those kind of laws? So isn't it likely that some of these cities are actually going to have pretty comprehensive rent control?
I mean, that's a great question. So before Costa-Hawkins passed, let's be really clear, there were only 3 cities in California that had vacancy control. It was Santa Monica, Berkeley, and I think Catani, which I actually don't even know where that is. So this was not like the majority of California had vacancy control. These were truly the absolutely most liberal small cities in California that even had vacancy control. And it was interesting, so Berkeley actually has a measure on the ballot that if Prop 10 passes, how they want to amend their rent stabilization ordinance in Berkeley. And there's 2 things Berkeley is going to do, or this proposition would do, is it would amend their ordinance to have a rolling deadline, which I do think you'll start seeing if Prop 10 passes, so that any building, any multifamily building that's over 20 years old would be covered by rent stabilization. And I believe the other provision is to cover single family homes. And I think that is a real sort of predictor of what you're going to see if that's what the most liberal city in all of California is saying they want to do if Prop 10 passes. I think it's a good indicator of what we'll see. I don't think we've seen any city in the entire country, even in other states that don't have Costa-Hawkins, pass vacancy control in decades. I mean, vacancy control is a pretty antiquated policy. So I just don't see us going there. And I wouldn't be surprised if the state legislature actually does some cleanup legislation and says that vacancy control will be illegal, even if the other provisions of Costa-Hawkins are repealed. Now that would take a state bill or another proposition, but I wouldn't be surprised to see that.
So, Chris, I want to give you a chance if you wanted to say something about how we got to where we are and
I mean,
why this is of such interest.
It probably will not surprise you that I am not in favor of this particular bill or this initiative. And, we're definitely live and breathe the supply side of this problem. And so whereas I appreciate the issue and the fact and acknowledge that there is definitely a housing issue, and particularly for median to lower income families and individuals throughout the state and in many parts of the country. I don't necessarily think this is the right path to solve that. As a matter of fact, I think this has the potential over the long term to actually be counterproductive. And some of the cities that have had rent control over the long term, you see as a disincentive for property owners to convert the use to for sale or other uses, because it just doesn't provide the upside potential that they're looking for as their own home, and they look for alternative paths for the use of that property. From a supply side, I mean, I think the policy issues that really aren't being addressed today, that everyone's focused on rent control, but no one's really focused on how do we provide truly affordable housing for people in need. And to me, that is the crux of the issue. This is a smokescreen of all things. It's a temporary solution, perceived solution. I don't think it's a solution at all. I think the real answer is how do we create incentives for market developers, affordable developers, cities, everybody in the chain of production to help provide enough housing to solve this crisis in the shortest period of time.
Good. Okay, so you can see we have a range of opinions on the panel. I wanted to pick up on something that Molly said. You said you focused on a particular group, the elderly, who are in need of cheaper housing or at least stable prices for housing. So let me ask that more generally. I'd like to ask this of all the panelists. I'm going to start with Molly, then go to Richard, then we'll go into the middle here. But do you think that stabilization through Prop 10 targets those most in need in general?
And so I just want to say, so Prop 10 itself doesn't change anything in terms of local law. It will take local legislatures or local ballot initiatives to have anything change. So Prop 10, if it passes, no impact the next day. It's what happens at the local level. It's just giving local control. So Prop 10 on itself will not help anyone. It just sort of opens the door, and then we'll see what happens. I do think that rent stabilization is a way to protect our most vulnerable residents in our cities. And a lot of people have said, well, we'd prefer to have something with means testing. We'd like to only limit this to low-income people. I know in the county of LA, Richard was on our tenant protections working group. When we were looking at this issue, we couldn't figure out a way to do anything that's means tested in terms of rent stabilization that wouldn't encourage discrimination. Housing discrimination is still a very big issue. And so you're just giving an incentive to rent to higher income tenants if you say rent stabilization only applies to people below a certain income. So we couldn't figure that issue out. Rent stabilized units are our largest supply of affordable housing. We have made a huge commitment to fund affordable housing at the county. We're working on an inclusionary housing ordinance. We're trying to get affordable units in every way we can. We have an aggressive density bonus ordinance update we're working on. It is a fraction of what you can do with rent stabilized units. So it is our largest supply and really important because of that.
Okay. Richard, would you like to address this as well?
So first of all, I appreciate the county becoming more aggressive in terms of things like density bonuses. And I really appreciate, I'll tell you, I think the state ADU ordinance, which the city of Los Angeles has embraced, is a wonderful thing. And I think it's actually going to be more powerful than people can even imagine. So I appreciate that.
Do you want to say what that is?
Oh, I'm sorry, because I always have a hard time saying the word auxiliary.
Accessory.
There you go. Auxiliary, I just have a hard time getting that word out of my mouth. Auxiliary, is that right?
Yeah.
Dwelling unit ordinance, which basically says if you have a single family house in the city of Los Angeles, you can build a granny flat, so long as your the slope conditions of your yard meet certain very reasonable standards.
No grandpa flat?
It could be a grandpa flat too, but you know what, 90%.
Want to make sure we're not
But 90%
discriminating to get them in here.
We're not, but 90%
I know
of the time,
not a lot of us make it.
Yeah, I was going to say, 90% of married couples that, the first death is a man. So that's, I think, we'll just call them ADUs, right? Okay, so no.
Yeah.
But this is one of my, so I have a number of issues with rent stabilization. To me, one of the most important is good social policy is one that targets people in need. And so I did a plot of the income distribution of people for the 3 largest cities in California that have rent stabilization: Oakland, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. And the reason only those 3 is because I was using American Community Survey data, which is a 1% sample, and any smaller than that, you just don't have enough data to do this sort of exercise. And I looked at stuff that was built in the 10 years before rent stabilization, the 10 years after rent stabilization. So you're trying to keep the housing stock at least comparable. And the income distribution is basically, and I'll share this data with anyone who's interested, the same. So there's virtually no targeting. It's sort of a random benefit regardless of your income. And so, yeah, about half the time people in need get it, and about half the time people who are much less in need don't. If you go to the 25th percentile, for example, in Los Angeles, so the top quarter, people in rent-stabilized units are making 6-figure incomes. I'm sorry, not Los Angeles, San Francisco, are making a 6-figure income. In the meantime, of course, there are many people who don't get the benefit of rent stabilization who are making a lot less. And I work the Obama administration. I actually support redistribution policies. I think the way you deal with people in need is you give them the resources that they need. And it's the absence of targeting is one of the things that most bothers me about any form of rent stabilization.
I just want to jump in because I would love to know, did you look at how long those tenants stay in the unit?
I have not done that.
Because I think that's what would be fascinating.
I can do that, but I have not done that.
There's essentially no benefit if you stay less than 5 years because you're going in at market. So you don't see the benefit for quite some time. So I think that's what would be fascinating is if the higher income people who go into rent stabilized units, do they stay long enough to get the benefit versus the low income people who probably have less opportunity to move. But I just would love to see the data.
I will run that.
Okay.
If you don't see it in a week, bug me about it.
Okay,
I promise I'll do it.
Because I would assume there has to be some incentives for some people that they're in a rent-stabilized unit, even if their incomes start going up, they figure, why not just stay in this unit and have greater disposable income?
A little factoid. So it is but the top 1% of people in rent-stabilized units in San Francisco are making $500,000 a year or more. In Los Angeles, it's $350,000 a year or more.
And that's probably due in part to this phenomenon, right?
That they got
such a good deal that
they stay.
Yeah. So.
But Molly, that's a good suggestion, and I'll run.
Molly or Chris?
I may be strengthening your argument against Prop 10. Just saying. See when you run the data.
I'll run it.
But we're a university. We believe in the facts.
Yes.
So, yes. So let's focus on this issue of, does it target those most in need?
I mean, I'm strongly of the opinion that it's not targeting those most in need. There is no testing. It's whoever ends up with a unit, and if you end up with somebody in a unit that is, well-to-do, making income, they can rent anywhere. That's taking a critical unit off the market, somebody who might need it, and even if it's just a year or two. We're in such dire supply of those opportunities, it just doesn't make sense to me that there isn't some level of means testing or whatever you want to call it. And so I think, no, it's not targeting at all.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't see that there is a provision in Prop 10 to skew it so that it benefits those that we would like it to benefit. That, again, is my concern. I would love for a measure like this to be able to assure us that the people that they're trying to serve will be the beneficiary, but there is nothing that demonstrates that right now.
Okay. There's a disagreement, but I hope, Richard, maybe if you do this additional study, we'll get some clarity on to what extent it's the right people that are actually in stabilized units now. I wanted to shift to this issue of supply that several of you have mentioned, and the fact that we don't seem to have the supply of housing that we need. So, why is that? Why doesn't the market just provide the kind of housing that, if there's people who are low income, high income, why doesn't the market just provide this housing? What's at bottom here that keeps supply from reaching demand?
I'd like to take that. In the affordable housing arena, you've got a lot of very skilled, very capable developers who are relying on public dollars to help make affordable housing possible. And one of the challenges is that the tool that has produced the most housing is the tax credit. But the tax credit is highly competitive. So at any given time, for example, we're based in Orange County, there are 2 rounds of competitive tax credits each year, and 1, maybe 2 will get through each year. So that means a possibility of 3 housing developments get built. But you may have at any time 20 developments competing. So you have the potential to build at an average of, I'm going to say 50 units. You've got 20 different developers competing for 1 spot, or maybe 1.5 spots. And that nonprofit developer, if we compete and don't make it into that first round because one of the other 19 beat us, we're going to go into the second round. If we're not successful, we'll go into the third round. Most nonprofit developers don't have the bandwidth or the cash flow to be able to service that debt, to cover the cost of holding that real estate. You've got a market that is very hot. We're trying to convince property owners, hang on for another 1.5 years. You will do well by feeling good, by holding it off and not selling it to that cash-rich international buyer who can buy it sight unseen. Take a chance with us, and at the end of 2 years, we will probably be able to buy it from you. It's a hard thing to say.
Does that sales pitch work?
It never works. It never works. I mean, we have for example, we bought a piece of property, I have to tell you, in Carlsbad. We managed to find a seller who had 21 of 25 duplexes. We bought all of them with the city's help for $375,000. We needed to buy the other 3. We managed to buy the next 2 for $750,000. We are developing around the one house that held out because he wants $1 million in a condo. The problem that we have is we bought that property in 2013.
Oh my goodness.
A month ago, we finally got through the CEQA challenge. A month ago, by one owner whose house backs onto our property. He rents it out as an Airbnb, and he managed to, of his own, stall that project. Imagine 4 years later the cost to develop it, the construction costs. And we now have a project that we are holding on to by the grace of God. When we talk about the supply and demand, what is the incentive if cities have tied up their resources and now their neighbors, because the economy is doing better, and guess what? This affordable development is 3/4 mile from the beach. People now are no longer interested in having homeless people in their neighborhood. How do we make that palatable? when you ask, well, how do we change the supply and demand? I would say, in addition to some of the efforts of a Costa-Hawkins repeal, is how do we reduce the red tape so that it does not allow us to be held hostage for that amount of time? That's where I think more effort should be put in.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd pile on all day with CEQA reform as one of the largest and single most difficult problems that keep us from doing everything that we want to do in the housing arena. And, you know, between the time that it takes, between the general economics, which I know everyone sort of looks at the landlord developer community as windfall day after day, you know, it takes us 6, 7, 8 years to get something built. I mean, how many people in here are doing something for 8 years just to get the first thing on the table, you know, to get that first result? It's a tremendous time drain and burden that you put into it. A lot of resources dedicated just to get to the first building built. You know, so CEQA reform, and then just, you know, no incentives whatsoever to encourage more development, particularly at the lowest end of the economic arena where this whole issue came about. You know, this whole sort of Prop 10 initiative, rent stabilization, rent control, it's all geared around solving a problem at, you know, the middle to lower income renter. And yet the state, even most local municipalities have done absolutely nothing to solve and encourage the development of affordable housing, which takes exclusively today significant tax credits and tax abatements. I mean, it's entirely a policy solution. There's no shortage of great, capable, affordable developers out there willing to do it. As she just indicated, you know, in Orange County, there'd be 20 developers in 1 year. That's 1,000 units, maybe 1,500 units, and they build 50. Why? Because we don't provide the tax credit support. We don't provide tax abatement. We don't provide the tools to allow them to do their job to solve the problem that's in front of us. And that is a society problem, in my opinion. It is a public policy society problem that we are now rising up and standing behind what needs to be done, which is to take the tools the government have to help solve this issue. Because if you're looking solely at the market rate developer type to come in and solve this problem, we'll be part of the solution and happy to be part of the solution, which is, you know, typically has got to come with some level of incentive to offset the burden that comes along with it. So increasing density, upzoning is certainly a great way of doing it. But it's a dramatic problem, and it's going to take a dramatic move in how we view housing, because everywhere you go, I mean, you're doing fabulous work, a great cause, and you get sued.
Yeah.
It takes you 3 or 4 years to get through it. I mean, that's a travesty. That's just unacceptable, in my opinion. We get sued all the time for the same cause, and every strata of income level, we do not have enough housing. How is that rational? It just doesn't seem to make any sense. So how we have a supply problem is we've got a public policy problem that's not engaged in solving the problem.
Is it primarily CEQA?
I actually want to add something in, because I think it's a whole bunch of things.
Yeah.
It is absolutely the red tape. It's absolutely the lack of.
What do you mean by red tape? I mean.
Well, I mean, and you know, I think you have to come to the table with the environmentalists. And I think part of the reason CEQA reform has gotten nowhere is because it's sort of been like, well, we just need to get rid of CEQA. And I think the environmentalists can be our allies, and we can really work with them on a rational approach to this. So I don't want
to just to challenge, most of the challenges that take place aren't environmentalists.
Yeah.
It's irrational neighbors, it's competitors, it's people,
it's the shopping center
it's
next door.
unions, it's folks who use the tool that's available to them to stop progress. It's not the merited folks who are trying to do good.
And I don't disagree that there are CEQA abuses that are absolutely outrageous. There are some CEQA challenges that are legitimate.
Yeah.
CEQA can't just disappear. That is not the answer, and I think folks have approached CEQA reform in a very aggressive way, and so we haven't gotten to figuring out what the right middle ground is where we can still address the environmental concerns while trying to reduce the abuses. But I also just want to say the other issue that we haven't talked about is construction costs, which are unbelievable right now and go up day by day. And I really don't understand why our state, and figure out at the county if there's anything we can do, we're not looking at the construction workforce issues in California right now, because construction costs are also a gigantic problem right now. It's not just a permitting issue, it's not just a land issue, it's not just a zoning issue, it is also construction costs are a huge problem right now.
Now, does public policy influence those construction costs in some way? In other words, suppose somebody had a new technology that could build modular that looked just as the same as stick building and so on. Would policy, laws, regulations have to change for that to happen? Or, are there barriers to making construction costs cheaper?
Yeah, I think the bigger issue is our construction workforce. I think technology is important to explore, and I have seen some modular projects move forward, and we haven't seen cost savings yet, so it's sort of like, I'm not sure. It's going to take a long time to see cost savings in modular. It's an option, but I think the bigger issue is workforce. We don't have enough people going into construction.
Okay.
I would say...
I just want to bring this back to Prop 10 for a second on the issue of supply, because if I knew Molly and her boss were the people implementing the policy, I'm still not crazy about it, but I don't worry that much about it. But I see this as an opportunity to weaponize rent control as a method to prevent new construction. Let's be frank, there are communities in this state that want no new housing. Palo Alto, they don't want any new jobs. The mayor has said so. And so when you say, and again, I'm terrible, we were talking about this before breakfast, I'm terrible at political forecasting, I'm sure you're much better at it. But I am not quite so sanguine that if Prop 10 passes, that there won't be political will behind putting rent control on newer buildings, putting rent control, doing vacancy control, because holy cow, I could get rid of zoning. If I say, you know what, you're a developer and you can't ever raise your rent, then nobody's going to develop in my community. And so I'd like some reassurance that it wouldn't be used that way. And given the way I observe local governments behave in California, I'm not reassured that that would happen.
Wouldn't the better solution here be, instead of taking this, sort of statewide ballot initiative approach, to really just do this at the state legislative level with a comprehensive package? And I know that sounds Pollyanna, but the truth is, that's where this should be done.
I'm excited to jump in on this one. I don't want to interrupt you.
Well, I'm happy. I hope you got an idea, because we're all happy.
Well, I want to talk about what happened with the Palmer fix. Because
I beg your pardon, Molly, I didn't hear what you just said.
I said I want to talk about what happened with the Palmer fix, because there were efforts to make very, very minor tweaks to Costa-Hawkins for years. For years, people were bringing bills saying, because when Jeffrey Palmer sued the city of LA because there were requirements for him to include affordable units in his building, and the California Supreme Court said, Costa-Hawkins is a little fuzzy on this issue. We think it may violate Costa-Hawkins to do inclusionary zoning, but state legislature, if you just change the language this way in Costa-Hawkins, inclusionary zoning would be legal. Like, the state Supreme Court opened the door. Advocates immediately brought legislation to make that minor tweak to Costa-Hawkins that would say Costa-Hawkins does not prevent inclusionary zoning. And the real estate industry, the California Association of Realtors, fought it so vehemently. Moderate Democrats lost their seats for supporting that bill, and we couldn't get it through for years. For years. The crisis had to get this bad for the governor to finally sign it last year. So yes, we should have addressed these issues at the state legislature, and the California Association of Realtors prevented that from happening. We could have had a much more moderate policy if the realtors had not been, and I have many realtor friends who I love. I don't mean this about individual realtors. I think there's lots of individual realtors, and I don't think the California Association of Realtors represents you well.
Just so we close out that discussion about the supply, you said workforce. Why is the workforce the issue?
Because we don't have enough people going into the construction trades, and so we can't, it's driving up the cost. We are importing construction workers from Texas to build right now because we don't have enough construction workers here in California. And you can imagine the cost of that if you're not just paying somebody's salary, but you're paying for them to live in California to do the job. I mean, it is really crazy what's happening in the construction.
Because that's an interesting point. Partly, and I'm not an expert on this, but I do know that if you, and Richard probably has the stats, but so I'm maybe on thin ice, but my understanding is that productivity, in like manufacturing, even productivity in large parts of the economy have gone up by hundreds and hundreds of percent. Whereas in housing construction, it's gone up like 6 or 7%. That's it.
That's right.
Right?
Since World War II.
Since World War II.
So it's basically not budged since World War II.
So there is housing is like a dramatic exception to the broad-based increase in productivity across the economy. And so, I understand the workforce issue, but there's also been most of the, certain portion of that productivity improvement has come from amazing technological improvements in how we, and processes by how we manufacture and produce services and goods, right? And that hasn't happened in housing at all. And I just don't know if that's due to public policy or something else.
Well, the whole labor chain is just, there's just not enough people, and that's at the city level, that's at the contractor level. I mean, there's just a misalignment of both talent and quantity of people to produce the quality of housing. So even if we had a massive upscale tomorrow, we would all struggle to find enough people to perform that work.
Yeah.
And at all levels, frankly.
So some of the elements of supply, as I've understood it from this conversation, part of it has to do with, or a major part of it has to do with time, and that is CEQA, which it can be abused. I mean, it can be partly for environment, but people can sue for almost no reason whatsoever, and the kind of delays that you talk about. Part of it has to do with this construction costs that they're so high that it's hard to get into the market at the low end, and part of that is the availability of workers. There are probably other regulations that affect this. And
Parking.
Pardon?
Parking.
Parking is clearly one of those. It's amazingly, that's one of the things I've learned from the nonprofit housing firm that I sit on the board of, is the cost of building parking and the regulations around that to have parking spaces for every unit really dramatically adds to the cost of the overall building. So these are some of the factors that increase supply. I also wanted to come back to this issue of I don't know what the right term is, but first or second generation stabilization. And I'm going to ask Richard to just give a little comment on this. Just from a economics point of view, could there be an argument that stabilizing initial rents with new construction, but then allowing rents to go up when people move out, that there is an economic argument in favor of something like that?
Yeah, so Richard Arnott is a professor at UC Riverside and an economist I admire very much. Has made the argument that he wrote a paper in 1995 called something like Time for Revisionism on Rent Control or something like that. And he is one of the very few economists who countenances the idea of any rent stabilization at all. But I also think he's one of the best urban economists living, so we need to take him very seriously. But he was talking about very specifically something called second generation rent control. So you think about first generation rent control is what we had during World War II and what survived in New York City, which is simply everything is controlled, vacancy, there's no vacancy decontrol, new construction is controlled, and there's pretty strong evidence that that is bad. And I don't think there's a lot of argument about that you really do discourage construction, right? They have first generation rent control in Mumbai, India, and you have this remarkable phenomenon of 20% vacancy rates in Mumbai, which is one of the most underhoused cities in the world, and it's because landlords don't want to take tenants in because then they basically can never get them to leave. Second generation rent control is sort of what we have here in California right now under the current conditions, which is new construction is not controlled at all. I would think Richard would say some sort of rolling rent control, rolling number of years, vintage would consider second generation rent control. There is vacancy decontrol, et cetera. And he basically argues that because land markets are so screwed up, that sometimes a policy that if markets are working properly would be bad policy, like rent control, lead to what's called a second best, which is you're taking a screwed up market, which is what he'd call in a third best position, and by applying a policy that you normally wouldn't like to it, you get to a second best position, so better off than you are right now. One of the things that concerns me, and you know what we have in California right now, again, if I were the czar of California, I wouldn't have rent control, but that's neither here nor there. It's not terrible though, it really isn't. Our dysfunction comes from things other than rent control right now. I really think that. But what repeal of Costa-Hawkins allows is the possibility of first generation rent control. And again, I am not sanguine that communities would not use this as a mechanism for bringing that back. And I don't know of any economist who thinks that would be a good idea.
We're going to have to go to question and answer questions from the audience. I think we've framed the issues both in terms of what Costa-Hawkins does, what it would mean if it was repealed, what are the alternative issues that we might do instead of repealing it. So let's, yes.
My name is Philip Armstrong. I was a Master of Planning graduate here in 2012, and I really appreciate all the information and the various points of views and the interchange. My question is in regard to when you were talking about if we're going to have rent stabilization, it should be means tested, and so in other words, that's based on need. And so when we're saying that incomes are not keeping pace with rent, and basically the middle class is being priced out of the market in these coastal cities, what would how are you defining need? We're talking about like the elderly who, they may or may not be, low income or a fraction of the median income, but yet they're still being priced out of the market that they're in. And so how do we define need? Is that the key? So who would like to address that?
That's a really good question. I'm sorry.
Richard, then Molly.
Go ahead, Molly.
I mean, I think it's really hard, and I'll just say I was an affordable housing developer as well for a number of years, and verifying people's income and going through all those steps is quite a bureaucracy, and we have a lot of landlords who don't want to participate with programs like Section 8 because of the paperwork and the bureaucracy involved. So I mean, it is challenging. And the need is pretty gigantic right now. If you look in 1 in 3 renters paying more than 50% of their income in rent, it's a lot of people who would have to be covered.
I'd like to add to that, because that was one of the challenges that I had. I don't want to seem like I am heartless, but I'm in the trenches and working on a daily basis and have started to field phone calls now. We do permanent rental housing, and it is not uncommon for us to get a phone call from somebody who's 2 days away from them and their family living out of their car. And that's not something I want to field, because that's not something that we can resolve. Most of our affordable housing has an 8-year to 10-year wait list. And it's because there is a limit on what's out there, and we have requirements that will state how we fill those units, how the wait list is established, and then it locks. And for affordable housing, what we're trying to do is provide housing where people are paying no more than 30%. for us to hit that need that you're talking about means that there is additional compliance, paperwork, and I don't see how we can handle that. I don't see how we have at the city level or at the public agency level or the government level the people to go through and verify that we've got the right people in at the right income levels. And it just seems to me to be another layer of, as she said, bureaucracy that will not move the needle. And I am nervous, as he said, that it opens the door to something like that coming. And we are struggling right now with the resources that we have to meet the need that we can with the provisions that I gave you. And in that example that I gave you, the 4 years of CEQA, and CEQA is not the issue, but I forgot to mention that now that we've gotten through that, we now have the opportunity to compete for the next 2 years. So we're not even guaranteeing that those units are coming onto the market. So there is a lot of red tape and bureaucracy that is put in place so that we can guarantee that those we are moving in actually have the need. And I think if we were to open the door, that we would just put that on steroids, and I don't know that people could comply with that.
So I was going to say, if you're heartless, then I'm a monster. But, but the question is, I mean, so the median income, I think I have this right. The median income person in a rent-stabilized unit in San Francisco makes $70,000 a year. And a non-rent stabilized unit makes, I think it's $90,000 a year, something like that. In most of the country, $70,000 would not be considered a low-income person. But in San Francisco, maybe that is a low-income person. So, you know, one of the hardest things government has to do, and that nobody thinks about, is how do you determine things like measuring poverty? Who are people in need? It's very context dependent. It's very much a function of the price level in the city where you are. And so I wish I had a glib answer for telling you what the number is. What I am sure of is it's different from place to place. One of the things I like about Section 8 is it basically, your subsidy is based on what are the area rents, and a way I would fix Section 8, which the Obama administration tried to do and the Trump administration repealed almost immediately, is do what's called small area rents. Right now, Section 8 is based on all of LA County, whereas it should be based on, Beverly Hills is different from Palmdale. There should be different levels for those different places. But, it's a really hard question. And it's like, you would need a group of well-informed people to sit down and come up with a reasonable formula for that number, which I know is not a very satisfactory answer, but it's the best I can come up with right now.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Gene Page with Bishop Pacific Partners. We're multifamily housing developers, and we're in Little Tokyo. And so we are a few blocks from the new metro station under construction, from which you'll be able to take a train to Santa Monica, Long Beach, downtown, everywhere. And the community meetings in the area are, we get these locals coming out saying, because Metro has some land that housing wants to be built on, and the locals come out and say, we want to see 1 to 2 story buildings built here on top of a major transit hub. What I don't see is leadership from the politicians saying to people, get over yourself, the city's changing, you don't live in a museum, and we have a problem. And we're going to see, and if cities never change, you'd be living in mud huts. So there will be changes, and especially on sites like this, we're going to go 40 stories in the air, because that's what we should do. Like big cities, if you're in Bangkok or Hong Kong or anywhere, you see towers all over town, 40 and 50 stories, and that's what should be, in my opinion, over a hub. I don't see the mayor or the supervisors preaching this message to people. that things
Is
have
that
to
a
change.
question to Molly?
Yes.
And so I will say I am a big supporter of density, we are trying to upzone where we can. It was interesting. I went to a meeting in Sherman Oaks on Thursday night, which you may have heard in the media coverage, about a couple homeless housing sites in Sherman Oaks, and it was a lively meeting. And the council member got up there, tried to talk to the community about what was being proposed, and they screamed, recall, recall, recall. We have a lot of education we have to do. I know at the county we've done a variety of ordinances. We're making residential available in commercial districts, upzoning around transit, trying to, do as much as we can by right as well, because, I think trying to do anything with variances, we need to put a lot more resources into updating our zoning code, because anything that requires a variance is just, it's too difficult, because our communities are not educated to support density right now, and it is a very challenging environment. But I do think people are trying to get in front of their constituents and educate them about these issues, but it was pretty ugly last week. That was specific to the population. That wasn't only density, but Sherman Oaks has a history of trying to recall over low density too. We've got a lot of work to do. And I do, like I said, I think some elected officials are trying, but I think even they are having trouble getting through on this issue.
Can I just name check somebody? Is Scott Wiener, who's a senator from San Francisco, the Mission District. And yeah, you could say, I don't like this or I don't like that about his particular piece of legislation. Generally, I actually do like them quite a lot. But he is taking real leadership on this. And I really admire him for he is out there on this. And so there are electeds who are taking leadership. And so I think it's incumbent on us to say how great we think they are for doing that.
Mm-hmm. My name is Al Ramirez, and I live in Santa Monica, and I moved here in 2002, and I moved into a new building. It had been 90% reconstruction because it burned down. And it was the only new building in the area at the time. And I was paying $1,000 a month, and everybody thought I was crazy because I was paying twice as much as what most people in Santa Monica were paying there because of rent control. Now a studio in my building is $2,600 a month. So I feel the heat all the time now that I've got new property managers, because they can get so much more for a penthouse 2 blocks from the beach than what somebody moved in there then. But the biggest problem in the building, and you talked about it with your tenant that had the Airbnb, and you talked about it about high income people moving and wanting to be in a desirable place. It's a desirable place. But the majority of my tenants in my building now are roommates and transient roommates and Airbnb. And it's like my dad always said, the way you fix a problem is you enforce the law. If they would just make these people one person to one unit or what's really on your lease, I think it would alleviate a lot of problem. Because it's real easy to keep your apartment in Phoenix or keep your house in Vegas and come work in LA 3 or 4 days a week and then fly back. Or go, keep your big house up in Kern County and come down and do your work and go back. And so, or live with your parents in Orange County and have your place that you party with up here with your friends during the week. So if we got rid of that, why can't we put that into the bill? Why can't we just ban Airbnb and enforce the residency rules to kind of alleviate the housing crisis and make people go back to where they're supposed to be and not have an extended vacation in LA?
So is the question,
yeah, can we,
can we eliminate Airbnb or something like that?
And there's policies that pretty much, at least the major urban jurisdictions, people are trying to do short-term rental ordinances. It is a very powerful lobby. The short-term rental lobby is very, very powerful. But the county has a short-term rentals ordinance we're working on. The city's been working on a short-term rentals ordinance for a long time, but the city is working on one too. I don't know exactly where Santa Monica is, but everybody's trying to get ahead of this issue, and it is a real challenge.
That's the one thing I think affordable housing development and the covenants does better than market rate, is that in our rental agreements, we do dictate who's on the lease, how many people per bedroom, how long a guest can come in. and those kinds of things, because we're subsidizing those. When it is privately owned, I go back to compliance. But as you said, if you've got the ability to do that and you can empower the property manager to enforce it, then it seems like it makes sense. With affordable housing, it's not an option. You don't enforce it, you may lose your subsidy. And so you don't have that. So when we talk about, you were talking about CEQA, and one of the biggest challenges is the parking. We don't typically have parking issues with affordable housing because you monitor who's in those units. Where a market rate unit, we've got our administrative assistant in our office is in a 2-bedroom apartment with 4 adults because that's what it takes to rent 2 bedrooms in Irvine. And each of those 4 adults has a job, and so each of them has a car, and so that adds to the cost of it. And so when you're talking about cost containment and housing and having an owner who wants to be able to improve that property so that they can get the next tenant in, they're looking at being able to increase that rent. And that's the benefit of the argument against Prop 10, is being able to allow them to do that, because if you're going to have them take that hands-on requirement, that there's a cost associated with it, and you usually cannot do it if you have to keep those rents artificially lowered.
So I want to defend Airbnb a little bit. I think, municipal laws that say no more than 90 days of short-term rental a year, something like that, are fine, because you don't want to be taking units off the market that would otherwise be going for rent. But for a lot of people, and Airbnb, Ed Kung at UCLA, I'm allowed to say that, right, has a very nice study out about the impact of Airbnb on rents, and it has a mild, pushes rents up a little bit. But there are a lot of people for whom Airbnb allows them to be in the unit where they are. Because without that supplemental income, they couldn't afford to live there. And so if it's not abused, and again, we can regulate it so it's not abused, it can be very helpful from an affordability standpoint. And Fannie Mae is talking about this for homeowners, being able to use Airbnb rental as an underwriting criteria for determining whether you can get a loan or not. The other thing about doubling up is I get very nervous about regulating that too severely. I understand where you're coming from, but in large swaths of Los Angeles County, if you go up the 605, the gateway cities, people would not be able to live here if it weren't for doubling up. And this is a symptom of the problem. LA has more families doubled up than any other large city in the country, and I mean as a percentage, not just total number. And if we were to remove that as an opportunity, then they're really up the creek when it comes to their housing opportunities.
Okay, we got one last question over here.
My name is Chris Manasarian. I'm from Gonzalez Law Group. I'm a land use attorney there. My question was just, do you guys see this as more of a municipality problem, or is this more of a kind of like, who's gonna end up fixing this? Because I feel like the more we trust municipalities, it's kind of just not really help the problem as much, because you kind of have the NIMBYs and everybody, like you said, the meetings, they get emotional. So what, I'm having trouble thinking that giving more power to municipalities to enact harsher regulations is kind of taking a step back, and the solution is going to come from.
So this question is it a municipality problem, yeah, right? And Kitty, we want to have you have the last question here. Maybe we could take these two together as our last.
Well, I had a couple comments, and one is that there's a law and a regulation in place, and you have to enable a certain amount of people to live in a unit, and only allowing one person in one bedroom is going to exacerbate the problem, not make it better. I think everybody here in the room believes that there's a housing problem and there's a shortage. It's what's the solution to that? And I guess my question is really to Molly, which is, we all agree there's a housing problem. You agree, and I think everybody else agrees, that Prop 10 isn't going to solve that problem. And Prop 10 also allows and enables some of these cities to create their own laws. And it's proven that in New York and some of these other cities, they're keeping units vacant, because if you have to re-rent it for $300, and by the time you pay your utilities, you can't afford to re-rent those units, and/or if vacancy decontrol gets passed in some of these cities, hundreds of thousands of dollars get passed under the table to a landlord, so the right tenant who's not really affordable gets in these units. Why would we not kick back Prop 10 and say, instead of saying, hey, let's pass it and do a subsequent bill to clean it up, to disable cities haphazardly to throw some of these requirements in there, why don't we pass on it and say, great issue, let's all come together and come up with a solution that maybe enables us to build more units, make more affordability, and solve the problem in general than asking us to continue with more legislation.
That would be
so
great.
we got
The California-
we got two questions here. One is the municipality the issue, and this one about why don't we do something more comprehensive and focus on just Prop 10?
I'll just say to your question, and I have a quick comment on the other question, but the California Association of Realtors will not allow the legislature to do anything on this issue. We would not be here, Prop 10 would not be on the ballot if there hadn't been decades of the Realtors Association preventing any legislation on this issue. So that would be great if the political forces would allow it, but they're not there. They are.
If we put a different ballot together rather than just saying repeal Costa-Hawkins.
I do, considering that the real estate interests are putting $60 million in to try and defeat Prop 10, I don't think they're going to allow anything to get through.
Oh, I don't agree with that. I think the pressure points are there. I think the real estate industry actually very much wants a solution to alleviate the pressure that's out there in terms of putting all the solutions in their basket. I think there is a desire for a general. I'm not going to speak for the California Realtors, but I will speak for, generally most of the industry that I'm affiliated with, and a lot of the conversations we have is about solving this problem.
So I want somebody to comment.
It's all comprehensive.
Could somebody comment?
I mean, it's not. The problem is today, what we see today is just one aspect. We just want to solve that.
I've never heard a real estate group support any tenant protection, any protection whatsoever, even eviction defense. And I will just say to your question, because I know you want us to get to that, this is a global issue. We are trying to address it at the local level, but it is a global issue. Homelessness tripled in Ireland. I mean, this is happening this is an issue in Canada, it's an issue in Europe. Housing costs and their relationship to income is going the wrong direction across the world right now. And so, I mean, we're trying to fix this with these tweaks at the local level, but it's much bigger than us.
I share your concern. Because as much as Molly talked about having a shortage of construction help, we've got shortages at the cities. As people were retiring out, we have a chasm of knowledge, and people are trying to come up to speed, and the staffing is not there. And so my worry is to put it at the local level without figuring out who at the local level is assigned to handle it means to me that we will be here in 5 years wondering what happened after this, why we haven't seen the results of it. So I'm absolutely nervous about the idea of having it go to a local body with no butts in the seats to make sure that it happens.
Okay, so we're out of time, so would you please join me in thanking our panelists for a very informative discussion? And of course, we also owe a great thanks to all of you for getting out early in the morning and dealing with the LA traffic and coming here onto campus to join us for this breakfast. You should look for future policy breakfasts that we do. We put these on periodically, and of course, we wouldn't be able to make this happen. This all costs money for us to do without our important sponsors. And I want to just quickly list who they are. Beverly Hills, Greater Los Angeles Association of Realtors, Budget Watchdogs.
No problem with looking.
Yeah, and so it looks like there might be a conversation after, but we are really appreciative of you supporting this event, and then Budget Watchdogs, and then we have a giving society for the Price School, just generous alumni and friends of the school who give and support our school. They're called the Athenian Society members, and I know there are several Athenian Society members here. So thanks to all of you for your financial support, for attending and making this event possible. And hope you have a good rest of the day. Thank you.